You learned very early that your place in the family was not given freely. It was earned. It depended on tone, timing, and usefulness. Love arrived with conditions so subtle they never announced themselves as rules. Yet you obeyed them as faithfully as gravity. You became the one who explained, the one who softened, the one who translated tension into reassurance. At the table, you spoke last. On the phone, you justified yourself before anyone accused you. During holidays, you preemptively excused your own presence, shaping yourself into something digestible so the air would not thicken. Silence, for you, was never neutral. It felt dangerous. It threatened disappearance. So you filled it. You filled it with reasons, with context, with apologies that had no clear offense. What you did not know then was that this reflex was not kindness. It was a contract written by a complex older than your adult mind, sealed long before you had words for it. There is a particular scene that repeats itself across many lives. Regardless of culture or era, a kitchen late in the evening, the light too white, the room too quiet, a parent's face unreadable, already withdrawn. You feel the pressure before a single word is spoken. You begin to explain yourself. Though nothing has been asked, you narrate your intentions, your fatigue, your loyalty. You hope that by making yourself transparent, you will become acceptable. What you are actually doing is offering your inner life as tribute to a silent authority whose approval once determined whether you belonged at all. The psyche remembers this moment with ruthless fidelity. It repeats it wherever power and affection overlap. Silence, in such a psyche, does not register as maturity. It registers as abandonment. And so you speak. This is the beginning of the darkness that must be named without consolation. The fatigue you carry is not caused by effort alone, but by the constant thinning of the self. Each explanation costs you a fragment of authority. Each unnecessary confession teaches the unconscious that your being requires permission. Resentment accumulates not because others demand too much, but because something in you keeps offering more than is asked. Identity becomes porous. You lose the sense of weight that tells others where you stand. What returns instead is repetition, the same relational pattern, the same exhaustion, the same silent disappointment that follows every attempt to be understood. In the language of the old alchemists, this is the blackening, not despair as drama, but erosion, the slow wearing away of inner edges. You believed you were maintaining connection, but the psyche was actually preserving an archaic bond at the cost of present authority. You believed silence would make you invisible, but what truly erased you was speech offered under compulsion. Night gathers around the stone walls, and the fire burns without urgency. Outside, frost tightens the ground, not violently, but with patience. What makes this pattern so resistant to change is that it does not present itself as pathology. It presents itself as morality, loyalty, sensitivity. You learned to equate love with responsiveness. goodness with availability. Yet beneath these virtues lies a mechanism that does not care for ethics. It cares for continuity. The complex that formed around early conditional love seeks only one thing, the repetition of its original arrangement. It does not ask whether the arrangement still serves the adult personality. It simply reenacts it wherever a similar emotional constellation appears. You believed that explaining yourself would prevent conflict. But the psyche was actually avoiding the terror of separation encoded in childhood. The consequence is subtle but severe. Authority migrates away from you. Those around you feel your permeability before they understand it. Some respond with respect tinged with distance. Others, sensing the absence of inner boundary, inflate their own persona in response. Hierarchies form not by intention, but by unconscious agreement. Here the figure of Narcissus appears, not as vanity, but as misrecognition. He does not fall in love with himself. He falls in love with an image that cannot answer him. The tragedy is not self-admiration, but the impossibility of relation. In your pattern, the image you offer others is endlessly reflective, endlessly accommodating. It mirrors their expectations so precisely that no real encounter occurs. They see themselves, you disappear beneath the surface. The air grows colder. An owl moves somewhere beyond the trees, unseen. Silence works psychologically because it interrupts this ancient circuit, not by strategy, but by withdrawal of fuel. When you do not explain, the complex loses its stage. The unconscious contract, I exist because I am useful, understood, agreeable, finds no immediate transaction. Anxiety rises, not because something is wrong, but because something habitual has been denied continuation. This anxiety is often misinterpreted as guilt. It is not. It is the sound of a mechanism failing to complete itself. You believed guilt meant you were harming someone, but the psyche was actually signaling the absence of a familiar exchange. The cost of misunderstanding this signal is enormous. You rush back into speech to relieve the tension, thereby confirming the contract anew. Each time you do so, the repetition compulsion tightens. The weighing of the heart in the Egyptian imagination offers a precise image. The heart is placed against a feather, not to judge morality, but to test heaviness. A heart burdened by unexamined obligation sinks. It cannot pass. Your explanations add weight. They are lead, not because they are false, but because they are unnecessary. Silence, when it is no longer a defense but a state, lightens the heart by removing what does not belong to it. Wind moves through pine needles, a dry, restrained sound. Socially, silence is often misread. It frustrates expectations. It disrupts familiar roles. Families, in particular, resist it, because roles are their primary currency. When you stop explaining, the system interprets it as rebellion or withdrawal of love. This is why silence does not work socially. It does not reassure. It does not smooth. It does not perform continuity. And yet, psychologically, it restores an internal access that no amount of relational approval can replace. You believed that harmony required your participation, but the psyche was actually sacrificing its own center to maintain external equilibrium. The consequence is not peace, but chronic inner displacement. Over time, the self retreats. What remains active is the persona designed to manage others' moods. Authority cannot grow there. Authority belongs to what remains when explanation is no longer required for existence. Ash settles in the hearth, soft, gray, final. There is often a dream that appears at this threshold, a house with too many rooms, doors without handles, voices speaking from behind walls. The dreamer wanders, responding to calls, opening spaces, never resting. The dream does not ask to be solved. It asks to be inhabited differently. When silence begins to take root, the dream changes. Rooms close, voices fade, one door remains, heavy, intact. This is not loss, it is concentration. Here the psyche begins its whitening. Though it may not feel luminous, awareness dawns that belonging purchased through self-erasure is not belonging at all. Projection withdraws. You see that much of what you feared losing was never truly yours. The permission to exist, once sought externally, reveals itself as an illusion. No authority you appeased ever possessed it. The night deepens. Stars emerge without announcement. Indifferent to witness. Silence. At this stage is no longer absence. It becomes boundary, not a wall erected in reaction, but a condition of being. Others may test it. Some will press harder, mistaking quiet for weakness. This reveals something essential. Those who require your explanation to maintain connection were never in relation with yourself. They were in relation with your function. You believed withdrawal would make you cruel, but the psyche was actually separating function from essence. The consequence is a loneliness that does not wound, it clarifies. In this space, resentment begins to dissolve, not because forgiveness is practiced, but because the repetitive injury ceases. Firelight flickers against iron tools, their edges dulled by use. What approaches now cannot be rushed or celebrated. It is the reddening, though no name is necessary. Authority returns not as dominance, but as weight. You no longer need silence to protect you. You are silent because nothing essential requires defense. Boundaries are no longer negotiated acts. They are the atmosphere around the self. Socially, this may look like distance. Psychologically, it is integration. The family script still exists, but it can no longer access the center. It knocks, there is no answer. Not out of defiance, but because the house is no longer organized around its demands. The lecture does not end in hope. It ends in gravity, the self seated, unannounced, unargued. Silence holds. The old contract lies unsigned on the table, its ink dried, its authority spent. The silence that now surrounds the self is not empty. It is dense, like air before snowfall, pressing inward rather than outward. This is where many misunderstand what has occurred. They assume that quiet has been chosen as a tactic, a withholding meant to provoke response or correction. That assumption belongs to the social I. Psychologically, something else has taken place. The center of gravity has shifted. Speech no longer rushes forward to fill every gap, because the gap itself is no longer experienced as threat. You believed that silence would cause misunderstanding, but the psyche was actually withdrawing its investment from roles that fed on exposure. The consequence is immediate and often disorienting. Relationships that relied on your explanatory presence begin to wobble. Some collapse quickly. Others attempt to restore balance by intensifying demand. Neither outcome is accidental. Both reveal the structure that was already there, invisible, only because you kept it running. In this phase, the psyche encounters a peculiar form of guilt that has no object. No one has accused you. No harm has been named, yet the sensation persists. Heavy and diffuse. This is not moral guilt. It is separation anxiety disguised as conscience. The complex interprets your non-participation as betrayal of an ancient order. The order says, you speak, you soothe, you translate, and in return, you are allowed to remain. Silence violates this agreement, and the psyche protests in the only language it knows. The night air cools the skin. Somewhere beyond the walls, water moves unseen beneath ice. Here, many retreat. They mistake the discomfort for evidence that something essential has been lost. They return to speech, often with greater urgency than before, explaining not only their actions but their silence itself. This is the most subtle form of self-betrayal. You believed that clarifying your withdrawal would restore balance, but the psyche was actually re-entering the same circuit under a different name. The consequence is exhaustion doubled by disappointment. Nothing changes except the depth of your own invisibility. The figure of Orpheus offers a precise image. He descends into the underworld not by force, but by song. He is permitted to retrieve what he loves on one condition. He must not look back. The tragedy is not impatience. It is doubt. The moment he turns, he confirms that he does not trust the process unfolding beyond his control. What is lost is not Eurydice alone, but the possibility of transformation through restraint. In the psychological sense, looking back is explanation. It is the attempt to verify externally what must be endured internally. Frost creeps along the window's edge, forming patterns that resemble script but resolve into nothing readable. Silence works because it deprives the unconscious of mirrors. Complexes require reflection to survive. They feed on reaction, reassurance, defense. When these are removed, the complex does not die dramatically. It withers. Its voice grows repetitive, then thin. Eventually it speaks only in echoes. This is why the early stages feel so loud inside. The noise is not new. It has always been there. You simply stopped drowning it in words. You believed the tension meant something was wrong, but the psyche was actually consolidating. The consequence of staying present to this tension is a gradual thickening of inner boundaries. Decisions no longer require consensus. Preferences no longer apologize for themselves. This is not indifference, it is differentiation. The myth of Persephone belongs here, not as abduction, but as seasonal rhythm. She moves between worlds, not because she is torn, but because her nature includes descent. The underworld is not punishment, it is depth. Silence resembles this descent. It removes you from the surface economy of approval and places you in a realm where value is no longer negotiated. When Persephone returns, the earth changes in response. She does not explain where she has been. The change itself speaks. Ash is stirred in the hearth, releasing a brief mineral scent. Social structures resist this shift because they depend on predictability. Roles stabilize systems. When one person stops performing, the system must adapt or expose its rigidity. Often it chooses the latter. You may be accused of coldness, distance, or withdrawal. These accusations are attempts to reassign you to your former position. Psychologically, they reveal how little your interior life was previously recognized. You believed being understood was necessary for closeness. But the psyche was actually confusing recognition with exposure. The consequence of disentangling these is profound. You become less available, but more present. Conversations shorten, yet deepen. Where once you offered context, you now offer weight. Some cannot tolerate this. They leave, others approach cautiously, uncertain how to engage without the familiar scaffolding of your explanations. The weighing of the heart returns here, but with a different emphasis. What is removed is not only obligation, but excess interpretation. You no longer carry others' projections as if they were your responsibility. The heart lightens not through virtue, but through precision. Stars sharpen in the cold sky, fixed, indifferent, exact. Dreams change again. You may find yourself standing at a threshold, a doorway without a guard. On one side, voices and movement. On the other, stillness. The dream does not compel you to choose. It shows you that both worlds exist, and that crossing no longer requires justification. This is a subtle but decisive moment. The psyche recognizes that access is no longer universal. You believed silence would make you less loving, but the psyche was actually stripping love of compulsion. The consequence is a form of relatedness that does not exhaust. Care is offered without self-erasure. Absence is no longer equated with abandonment. Presence no longer demands performance. The Egyptian image of Osiris comes into view, dismembered, scattered, reassembled. What Isis restores is not the old body, but continuity. Authority emerges from reconstitution, not domination. In psychological terms, The self gathers fragments previously dispersed through excessive responsiveness. Silence is the binding agent. It allows what was scattered to return without instruction. Firelight steadies. The room holds its shape. At this stage, silence no longer feels like resistance. It feels inevitable. Speech returns, but it comes from a different place. It is slower. It does not hurry to prevent misinterpretation. It does not correct projections. It allows misunderstanding to exist without panic. This is often perceived socially as aloofness. Psychologically, it is coherence. You believed being clear would prevent rupture, but the psyche was actually maintaining attachment through self-sacrifice. The consequence of relinquishing this is not chaos, but recalibration. Those capable of relation adjust, those dependent on function cannot. The biblical image of Jacob wrestling at night serves not as morality, but as structure. He does not win by overpowering. He endures until morning. Wounded, renamed, silence resembles this struggle. It is not passive. It is the refusal to resolve prematurely. The wound is not damage, it is mark. Authority carries a limp. It does not rush. Morning approaches quietly, without announcement. What remains is not peace in the sentimental sense. It is alignment. The self no longer leaks through explanation. Family scripts still operate, but they run elsewhere. Unable to penetrate the center, social misunderstanding may persist. It no longer governs. The psyche settles into its own weight. Silence holds, not as strategy, but as condition. Speech, when it comes, is no longer an offering. It is an expression. What now confronts the psyche is not conflict, but emptiness of a particular kind, not the void of depression, but the absence left when a familiar inner authority has been dethroned. The voice that once insisted you explain, soften, anticipate, has not vanished entirely. It has lost jurisdiction. It speaks without mandate. This is often mistaken for freedom too early, and the psyche punishes haste. Silence at this depth is no longer a practice. It is exposure to oneself without intermediary. You believed that once you stopped explaining, clarity would arrive quickly. But the psyche was actually dismantling an internal hierarchy that had governed you since childhood. The consequence is a period of disorientation that carries no narrative. There is no obvious relief, only a strange neutrality where old reflexes attempt to activate and find no response. This neutrality is not emptiness. It is unclaimed territory. Cold air moves through the trees. The sound is thin, almost metallic. Here emerges the temptation to replace one authority with another. Some turn silence into performance. A rigid withholding meant to provoke recognition. Others replace explanation with withdrawal, so absolute it hardens into isolation. Both are substitutions, not integrations. They preserve polarity rather than resolve it. Psychological silence is neither display nor absence. It is the cessation of compulsive exchange. You believed that power would come from being unreadable, but the psyche was actually seeking indivisibility. When silence becomes armor, it still reacts, it still calculates. The consequence is a brittle authority that fractures under pressure. True authority does not defend itself. It simply does not enter transactions that require defense. The image of the false god in Gnostic imagination clarifies this mechanism. The Archon does not rule through force, but through misdirection. It convinces the soul that compliance equals survival. In psychological terms, the complex masquerades as conscience. It tells you that if you do not respond, you will be erased. Silence exposes the fraud. Nothing essential disappears. Only the illusion of necessity dissolves. Snow begins to fall lightly, each flake distinct, unhurried. As this realization settles, a deeper fear emerges, one rarely named. If you are not required to explain yourself, what remains of your identity? Much of what you called me was shaped in response to expectation. Silence strips away the reactive layers, leaving something unadorned and initially unfamiliar. This is why the process cannot be rushed. The psyche must learn to recognize itself without reflection. You believed that others defined you, but the psyche was actually using others as mirrors to avoid confronting its own center. The consequence of removing these mirrors is a temporary loss of orientation. This is not regression, it is recalibration. Dreams at this stage often feature abandoned structures, a school no longer in use, a theater with torn seats, a temple without priests. These are not symbols of loss, but of decommissioning. The psyche is closing institutions that once organized your inner life but no longer correspond to who you are becoming. Silence allows these closures to occur without replacement. The alchemists knew this phase well, though they warned against naming it too eagerly. It is the moment when purification has removed what is false, but union has not yet arrived. The material feels inert, meaning thins. One must resist the urge to reanimate old forms simply to escape stillness. A distant bell sounds once, then fades. Socially, this stage is often the most misunderstood. Others sense the change but cannot locate it. You may be described as distant, altered, no longer yourself. In a narrow sense, this is accurate. The self they knew was partially a construction maintained for relational stability. That construction is now dissolving. What replaces it is quieter, heavier, less negotiable. You believed loyalty required continuity, but the psyche was actually mistaking familiarity for truth. The consequence of releasing this is grief without drama, not the grief of loss, but of recognition. You see how much of your life was shaped by agreements you never consciously made. The myth of Job offers an image stripped of consolation. He speaks, but his speech does not justify. He does not explain his worth. He addresses the abyss directly and receives no moral answer. What remains is presence under weight. Silence, in this context, is not submission. It is refusal to bargain with meaning. Ash cools completely, leaving only pale residue. At some point, speech returns, not as defense, not as clarification, but as statement. This is often brief, sometimes awkward, occasionally misaligned with social rhythm. It carries no excess. It does not anticipate reaction. This speech feels risky precisely because it is no longer managed. Yet it does not produce the catastrophe, the complex predicted. The world does not end, something else does. You believed restraint would make you smaller, but the psyche was actually condensing. The consequence is a presence that does not expand to fill every space, yet alters the space it occupies. Others feel it as gravity rather than force. Here, the tension of opposites stabilizes. Love no longer competes with fear. Loyalty no longer demands self-betrayal. Kindness ceases to be compulsive. Desire no longer disguises itself as duty. Disgust loses its moral overlay and becomes information. Closeness and freedom are no longer mutually exclusive, because neither is being used to regulate the other. The image of iron in the furnace belongs here, not molten, not rigid, but held at the precise temperature where shape can be altered without destruction. Silence is the heat, too little, and nothing changes. Too much, and form collapses. Psychological maturity consists in tolerating this temperature without fleeing into explanation or withdrawal. The night clears, stars sharpen again, fixed, impersonal. What emerges now is not confidence, but alignment. Authority is felt inwardly as coherence. Decisions arise without consultation with imagined others. The internal committee dissolves. There is no need to convince, because there is no longer an internal opponent to persuade. You believed authority was something granted, but the psyche was actually withholding it from itself until conditions were met. Those conditions were never external. They consisted solely in the willingness to endure silence without compensation. Family scripts may attempt final access at this point. A sudden crisis, an appeal framed as need, a reminder of past roles. These are not malicious, they are reflexive. The system senses loss of control and seeks restoration. Silence responds not by argument, but by non-entry. The script speaks, no one answers. Wind moves across frozen ground, low, continuous. This is the beginning of irreversibility, not because you have chosen a stance, but because the psyche has reorganized around a different center. Returning to compulsive explanation would now feel false, almost theatrical. You could do it, but it would cost you something immediately perceptible. This is how you know the shift is real. You believed silence was something you adopted, but the psyche has made it unnecessary to adopt anything. It has become the natural state from which speech occasionally emerges. Here, the false god loses relevance. The archon cannot command what no longer recognizes its authority. Control dissolves not through confrontation, but through neglect. What remains is the self, unannounced, unadorned, seated where negotiation once occurred. The alchemical red does not blaze, it settles. Integration is not ecstatic, it is ordinary in the deepest sense. You wake, you speak when needed. You do not when it is not. The difference is not visible from a distance, but it is absolute internally. Silence has completed its work not by being maintained, but by no longer being required. There is very little left to say now, which is precisely why the psyche has reached its final configuration when silence no longer feels like restraint, when it no longer needs to be guarded or remembered. It has ceased to be a position. It has become background. What remains in the foreground is not personality, not strategy, not virtue, but something older and heavier than all of them combined. You believed the end of this process would feel like relief, but the psyche was not aiming at comfort. The consequence is a sobriety that cannot be celebrated. You are no longer animated by the need to be seen accurately. Misunderstanding does not provoke correction. Agreement does not produce warmth. Disagreement does not threaten coherence. These reactions do not disappear because you are above them, but because they are no longer necessary to maintain inner structure. At this depth, one encounters a final illusion, the hope that silence will be recognized, perhaps even respected. This hope belongs to the last remnant of the social self. It imagines a world in which restraint is rewarded with acknowledgement psychologically. This hope must be abandoned without resentment. Silence works inwardly, not outwardly. When it is effective, it becomes invisible. Others may interpret it however they wish. Their interpretations no longer reach the center. The night is very still now. Snow absorbs sound. Distance collapses. Here, the opposition between psychological truth and social reality becomes absolute. Social systems function through exchange, signal and response, gesture and reassurance. Silence disrupts this economy. It does not circulate. It does not invite return. This is why it fails socially. It cannot be integrated into systems that depend on mutual performance. Psychologically, however, its failure is its success. It removes the self from transactions that require fragmentation. You believed relationship depended on participation, but the psyche was actually confusing contact with exposure. The consequence of correcting this confusion is not isolation, but selectivity without explanation. Some bonds persist, stripped of drama. Others dissolve quietly. Neither outcome requires justification. The dream image that often accompanies this final stage is simple: a path through a forest in winter, no signs, no voices, footsteps visible only briefly before snow covers them again. There is no urgency to arrive. The movement itself is sufficient. This image does not promise direction. It confirms orientation. In biblical language, the burning bush belongs here, not as revelation that commands action, but as presence that does not consume. It speaks without instruction. It authorizes nothing. It simply is. Psychological authority resembles this. It does not tell you what to do. It makes certain actions unnecessary. Ash has long since cooled. The hearth holds only form. At this point, even the idea of family script feels distant. not erased, not denied, but irrelevant. It can still be observed operating elsewhere, like a language you once spoke fluently and now only recognize. It no longer addresses you. Appeals based on guilt or obligation fail, not because you resist them, but because they arrive in a register that no longer connects. You believed liberation required confrontation, but the psyche was actually disengaging. The consequence is quiet permanence. There is no urge to declare independence. Independence is not declared. It is assumed by the structure of being. The tension of opposites does not disappear. It settles into balance without resolution. Love remains capable of fear. Loyalty still carries the memory of betrayal. Kindness and disgust coexist without explanation. Closeness no longer threatens freedom because freedom no longer requires distance. These opposites do not reconcile through insight. They coexist because the self is now large enough to hold them without fragmentation. Iron cools into shape, no longer malleable, no longer fragile. Socially, you may be described as distant, reserved, even indifferent. None of these terms are accurate, yet none require correction. Psychological silence has no interest in reputation. Reputation belongs to the persona, and the persona is no longer the organizing principle. What speaks now, when speech occurs, does not seek alignment. It states. What remains silent does not wait. You believed this process would make you more visible to yourself, but the psyche was actually removing the need for self-observation. Excessive self-reflection was part of the same circuit that required explanation. When that circuit dissolves, the self does not become an object of contemplation. It becomes the ground. Stars fade slowly as morning approaches, not because they have moved, but because something brighter arrives without announcement. There is no closing gesture, no summation, no final teaching. Authority does not end with a sentence. It ends with weight. The family contract no longer binds because it no longer reaches anything that responds. The unconscious agreement has expired, not through rebellion, but through obsolescence. Silence remains not as practice, not as discipline, not as stance, as condition, as gravity, as a simple fact that the self no longer needs to speak in order to exist.